Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I'm sure you've all filled your stomachs and you're good to go. My name is Funke Smith, and I am here as the moderator today for this interesting corner, which is inclusive strategies. And with me today, I have a wonderful panel, and I will start with a lady beside me. Could you please introduce yourself?
Thank you. Thank you so much. My name is Litsi Baeza. I use the pronouns she and her. I'm here in representation of Architequity. We are a Afro-descendant Latin American international development cooperative based in Edmonton and Toronto, who look at reorienting mainstream approaches to make an equitable outcome. So we work with a variety of equity frameworks and analysis in different organizations across Canada and internationally. So welcome, thank you very much for being here with us today.
Wonderful. And the other lady to my right.
Hello, everyone. My name is Catherine Anley, and I am an employment coach with the Mustard Seed. The Mustard Seed is a not-for-profit agency that provides wraparound services and support for persons living in poverty, dealing with housing insecurity, food insecurity, working poor, individuals who are unhoused. And as an employment coach, I work with individuals, community members wishing to re-enter the workforce. Prior to my time with the Mustard Seed, I was a senior consultant, equity, diversity, and inclusion at the University of Alberta for quite a few years. I shall not age myself, so I won't tell you how long, but it was long. So great to be here. Thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you. And the gentleman.
Thank you very much. My name is Phil, and please call me Phil. That's fine. A bit about myself. I was born in England of Guyanese parents. I came to Canada at the age of 10. Grew up just outside of Toronto, a town called Oakville. Joined the Toronto Police Service. Served 31 years as a Toronto police officer. After I left the Toronto Police to join Centennial College, they asked me to run their Police Foundations program. And I've now been doing that for 15 years. Included in that journey of teaching at Centennial College, I acquired my master's. I wrote a paper on racial profiling that was published and gained some traction, and I was prompted to do the PhD. And so now almost finished my PhD in implicit bias. Not at the same university as you. I'm at U of T, right? But the implicit bias journey has taken me on a lot of different turns that I never expected. And part of that is working with a company called TNT Justice Consultants, which led me to here today. So I'm sure we'll get into a lot of all those different things as we speak. Thank you very much for having me here.
Thank you, Phil. You are all very welcome. And I will, follow that with just introducing myself more. I am the executive director at Skill City Institute, and Skill City Institute is a social impact organization. Here in Edmonton, we help to create career and employment pathways for young people, particularly young people from under-resourced, underrepresented communities. We have a strong focus on STEM education and STEM literacy because we want to channel more young people into STEM industries. We believe STEM is the backbone of the economy, and there are more lucrative careers in the STEM fields, and we believe that this is one of the ways we can help to empower youth in our communities. Thank you, everyone, for being here today. And yes, so we will be talking about inclusive strategies today. I work in a nonprofit field, and that is a very, very big topic in our field, equity, diversity, and inclusion. And so in the context of the workplace, it is very difficult sometimes to be able to strike that balance because we all come with different views, from different backgrounds, different needs. And so how then do we ensure that everyone is included either in the development of policies or in some of the terms that we have laid down for employers or for how we actually deal with the public? Today I have with me experts in the field who will speak to this topic, and I'm sure that we will do justice to it. So my first question today is, so how can we ensure as organizations that we are inclusive? What are some inclusive strategies that you are aware of that you think that organizations today in the 21st century should be implementing?
Yeah, thank you. So I want to put diversity on the side because diversity is a part of every environment. What's important is to really look at those inclusive strategies within organizations that will ultimately lead to equitable outcomes. So in order for an organization to really understand how to implement inclusive strategies, for us at Architequity, it's really important that we do assessments, whether that's consultations, focus groups, surveys, questionnaires, to really get an understanding of who those employees are within the organization, what their demographics are, what are those intersecting identities that exist. And then the organization can really pinpoint and look at what an inclusive strategy looks like within their organization. I think for myself and for my colleague, we find ourselves amongst organizations that want to implement a one-size-fits-all strategy, and that just doesn't work. Inclusivity, equity is intentional. It takes time. It's a journey. It really needs to be understood. You really need to dive deep into what your employees' needs are in order to really create those inclusive strategies that will really work within the organization. So when you ask what inclusive strategies or what examples exist, I can't really talk to that because it's really important that as an organization, we really look at who our employees are in order to effectively implement those inclusive strategies.
Absolutely. Thank you. Could you speak to that, Catherine?
Absolutely. And you know, I also use the analogy one size fits all, or I should say one size doesn't fit all. And I use that analogy when I talk to leaders about policy development. And I talk about, so a t-shirt, one size fits all. Does it really fit all? And so we have that conversation, and no, of course not. It fits a certain body, a certain type. And so then I talk about then how do we actually develop policies that are broadly based, that people are included, that they're not further marginalized, that they're not left out. And so then I speak to intersectionality, a term coined by Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw in the early 80s, and it's really looking at a framework. It's a prism. How do we understand the impacts of certain policies, practices on bodies, on individuals, and then have that interrogation. How do we engage with it? How do we discuss it? And how do we move forward to rethink some of the policies, or to rethink how do we interact with colleagues? I think a lot about who's at the table, right? Who's at the table making the decisions? And if the table is not very diverse, okay, sometimes that's the reality for a company, well then how will you get that input from a diversity of people, of ideas? So reaching out, getting input, but really listening to that input and really making the changes that employees or maybe customers, clients are giving you.
Thank you. Phil?
Thank you. Powerful set of statements to follow from both of you. Thank you. I note that the terms inclusivity and collaboration have already been used. I think they're very key components. I approach this from the lens of my experience at Centennial College in Toronto. And I'm very proud of the way that Centennial has approached this entire issue. And so what they've done there is, first of all, we've had 3 consecutive terms of leadership from our president, Ann Buller. Female president, and coincidentally, at the end of her reign, the majority of the senior leaders of our college were female. She then was succeeded by Craig Stevenson, who is an openly gay male president now. And again, coincidentally, we have more visible gay men in the leadership roles. So there obviously seems to be some kind of a pattern here. When you have people who reflect society generally in those uppermost positions, it filters down through the organizations, right? I think a key component here is that the leadership involved in these type of initiatives has to be from the top down. It has to be bought in from the highest levels and filtered down. It filters then down through the organizations. At Centennial, we then formed what's called the Anti-Black Racism Task Force, right? And it's not simply for black people, but that is the name of the organization, and it covers many different aspects of representing marginalized populations and seeing that things are put into place that will enable them to gain position and place and power within the organization. One of the key things that the Anti-Black Racism Task Force does was it articulated very clearly what its mandate was, what sort of things they were looking to try and accomplish. They made sure that those were measurable and that there's accountability built into the system. They then went a step further. They made sure that it was inclusive when they designed the whole process and all of the aspects of the elements that they wanted to put into their processes, and not only from within the college, but from within the community at large. I feel that the community colleges are in an excellent position to affect real change, both within themselves and within the communities. And so as a result of this, that collaboration, that effort, that synergy that's been created, I feel that they've created a very viable project that seems to be working. It's the most effective one that I've seen since the killing or murder of George Floyd, which was 2 years ago this month. I've been involved in several organizations that have been trying to get into this space, and the one at Centennial is the only one that has proved sustainable and gained any sort of traction. Thank you.
Interesting. Interesting. So we will take note of some of those best practices because indeed today there are so many campaigns about equity, diversity, and inclusion policies in the workplace. So we know that, a lot of things are based on policy for every structure. And some people are the helm of affairs, making these policies. How can we ensure that these policies reflect and cater to the needs of each diverse person who's coming into that organization or who is a stakeholder, as it were, within the context of that organization? Do you have any, tips you can give us on this from the perspective of policy?
Sure, yeah. Policies and documents are very important. One of the things, I talked a little bit about assessments in the first piece, but the other piece that's really important is really taking a look at those policies and documents that exist within organizations, because that's where you're really going to find inequities. Just through language, through practices, through processes, through systems. So policies are essential to be looked at. Remember, we live in a North American white supremacist society. So the processes and systems that are in place come from that lens. We really need to be intentional. Again, if we're really looking at inclusivity and ultimately equity, we need to look at documents, we need to look at policies, we need to talk to the people that work there. There's a variety of steps that need to be taken in order for an organization to be intentional in these practices and ultimately get to equity, which is what we strive for, equitable outcomes for all.
Thank you. Catherine?
So there's two things that's coming to mind for me. The first one is that sometimes within organizations, equity, diversity, and inclusion is a separate thing. It's separate in HR, it's separate in various departments, and it really needs to be embedded throughout. But how do we do that, right? So I always propose that we start embedding EDI accountabilities, expectations in job descriptions. This is something that we all have a part to play. It's not going to be achieved alone. We all have to work together as an organization, as a society. So one thing that I would recommend, let's take a look at our job descriptions. The other thing that I like to talk about is a very practical example of a policy or practice that leaves certain people out. And that's the first paycheck. So when someone is first hired, usually it takes 2, 3, or maybe more weeks before they first get that first paycheck. When the clients that I work with who are experiencing poverty, who are often very low income, that waiting that long for that first paycheck, can't do it. And so they leave. One, it's too embarrassing to tell anybody. 2, they can't put food on the table. They can't take the bus. They don't have money for a bus pass or bus tickets. But organizations don't cut checks normally anymore. Like it's all automated, and you have cutoff dates. And I understand that streamlined systems saves money. Yes. Who's left out? So I wonder if there's an opportunity to build in some flexibility. Is there a way for someone, after they've worked for the first week, maybe to get a check? It might be direct deposit. Maybe you don't have to cut a check, but how can we create that opportunity? What the Mustard Seed does is that we give people bus tickets, and we give them gift cards for food, and they talk to us. They're not so comfortable, of course, talking to the employer. So how do we create an open door, comfortable environment so someone could ask the question? Or can we just make it like automatic for everyone? This is a new practice. Maybe it's not quite as cost-saving as others, but everyone has that same opportunity. So just a thought. Anyway.
Interesting.
Thank you.
Please.
At Centennial, I mean, there are some very basic things that you can do, like when you have an application that you're putting out as a job prospectus, run it through a gender decoder. Gender decoders are readily available, free of charge online, and it just simply goes over your document to tell you, is the language in that document skewing it toward one particular segment of society or another? And it can be very enlightening using something as very basic as a gender decoder. We then go on to instill some form of accountability in the form of APR, the Annual Program Review, the CPQR, which are processes that every college is required to go through, where they are evaluated by the key stakeholders, mainly the students and other people in the PAC. A PAC is a Program Advisory Committee. Then every college program has a PAC, and all of these people have input into these things. There was something mentioned in the session earlier today about having diversity on panels that are doing the interviewing. And if you don't have that diversity, there are places you can go to get that diversity. And the one thing I'm going to be taking back to Centennial is the idea of having members of your PAC possibly sitting on those committees, because you have diversity in your PAC, even if all your professors and their leadership is from the dominant culture. At least now gives you that ability to bring that diversity to the panel. And that's very important. When someone's going for a job interview and they're sitting in front of a panel and nobody in that panel looks anything like them, whether they think it's happening or not, there's a thing called stereotype threat, which we'll talk about later this afternoon. It's in the back of their head, right? It's there, and it's real.
Interesting that you mentioned PACs, Program Advisory Committees. I am privileged to be the co-chair for a PAC, a Program Advisory Committee here for a post-secondary institution here in Edmonton. I'm just trying not to mention names. And I can tell you that I think they get it right when it comes to how they implement that diversity in who they bring to the pack. Apart from looking at the different industry segments and trying to bring people in that will be able to advise them towards how to prepare students for the workplace of today, which the work landscape is continuously changing, and so the policies of yesterday or the strategies of yesterday might not work for today. And so I see that indeed program advisory committees play a very, very strong role because I know how we have been able to kind of give our views on how some of the policies they are implementing at that post-secondary are going to help the students that are actually coming through. So that's actually very important. But I'd like to also go to a point that was made by Catherine about this clients of ours who might need a different approach to how we manage policy. If we have a policy as an organization that we do our payroll on the 24th of every month, and this person has started work on the 7th, but then those 2 weeks, they can't even get money for transportation, and how do they even continue to come to work? And I understand that. However, but the organization can also think, if we give money right away to this person, what if they just go away? What if they don't come back, right? And it brings me to that question, which I've asked several people in the past few weeks, because it's a topic that's really burning in my heart. How do we make a distinction between equity and equality? Because those two are not the same thing, and they could apply differently. How do we ensure that we are truly meeting the needs of the people that we say we are catering to by actually establishing that balance between equity and equality in the workplace or within the context of an organization? What do you think about those two terms?
Yeah, I think a lot of people still get equality and equity confused, and I think it's really important that we put equity on the side, equality on the side. It's equity that we really need to focus on. And again, I'm going to go back to the assessments. I'm going to go back to those document and policy reviews and other things that an organization can really do to look at those inequities that exist, right? Because that's where you're going to find those inequities for people. That's where you need to take a different approach and look at through whether it's an intersectional lens, a racial equity lens, a gender lens, for example, to really understand who is not benefiting, right, within the organization. Equity is looking at systems and barriers that exist for people, because not all of us will get to be equal, right? That's why I say there's a lot of confusion between equality and equity. Equity is looking at, again, those barriers that exist for people so that we all can start almost from the same starting line, right? And that we can look at those deeper systems and processes that exist in organizations. I've done a lot of documents and policy reviews, and I can't tell you how many inequities exist within those. And I'm not just talking about policies and documents, I'm talking about the websites. I'm talking about communication that goes out, internal, external communications. Are we using the right language? Are different people benefiting from that? Are others not benefiting from that? Where's the power inequities? What about privilege inequities? So it's really taking a deeper look. A lot of organizations don't want to do that, right? They want to just focus on this one-size-fits-all approach to inclusion and equity, and hopefully everyone will have what they need. But that's just not the case. That's not how it works.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Anyone would like to speak more to that?
So an example that comes to mind about treating someone equitably would be during the recruitment phase. Let's say you have hearing loss and you require an interpreter to participate fully in the interview. And you advise the hiring committee that you require an interpreter, sign language interpretation. But when you have a third party then the date and time of the interview might need to be changed. But the committee will say, yeah, no, can't do that because we've scheduled you for this time. Obviously, you don't want the job. So that's discrimination, highly problematic. Treating someone equitably may mean treating them, actually will likely mean treating them differently. People get caught up in, oh, that's not fair. I'm not treating everyone the same. No, that's because we're not all the same. So in terms of recruitment, if there's an interview and someone's requesting an accommodation, they might request a different time or day because they have childcare responsibilities or elder care and they have to make arrangements. All kinds of different reasons why they may need to change the meeting time. An accommodation would be to give them that change. So that means that you have to step back. What are your processes? Sometimes hiring managers are very stressed. Well, not sometimes. Often they're stressed for time. And they schedule everything, one right after the other in this 2-day period. Okay, you got to build in flexibility within your recruitment process so that you can accommodate those changes and it doesn't throw you off. You can just take it in stride and say, yeah, I can do that. How about next week? Does that work? Or have those conversations. But so that's just some practical examples.
Pretty interesting lens you brought in there. Indeed. Phil, did you want to add to that?
Sure, if I could. The idea of equity, I think it speaks to one of the key drivers behind this whole conference this weekend, and that being the implicit bias. And in order to achieve that equity, we need to make the implicit known within the people who are doing the interviewing, within the whole structure of the organization, so that the person, once they get into the organization, feels comfortable and is treated fairly and equitably. And to that end, at Centennial, what we've done is I've been tasked with introducing the implicit bias testing into our curriculum and possibly elsewhere within the system, right? And so I took a 1-year leave of absence to finish my PhD from Centennial, and it's in implicit bias, specifically implicit bias in police recruits and their instructors. And I originally started my focus at the Ontario Police College and then expanded it to RCMP Depot, where all of the recruits for the RCMP are trained. And it was interesting to note what happened from a systemic point of view. It took a year to get permission to go into the Ontario Police College just to run the tests, and we can talk about the possible reasons of fear, whatever else was behind all of that. When it was finally sent out, I had 0 responses from the instructors at the Ontario Police College and 0 responses from the recruits at the Ontario Police College. So then I looked to the RCMP. I got 0 responses from the instructors at the RCMP and 32 out of a possible 400 of the recruits at the RCMP Depot. Then the director for recruiting of the RCMP comes across the implicit bias test, and he would like to test the entire RCMP with this thing if he could immediately, but he can't because of structural issues. So it's put out to the applicants, people applying to that job. And within 3 months, 5,282 responses. So this massive secondary data I can now use in my entire thesis. So the point here is that there are fear factors involved in doing things like implicit bias testing, and we need to understand what they are, address them, so that people will feel comfortable in using this self-help tool, right? It's not used in a punitive manner. It's used to help identify where your biases are, and everybody has bias in one area or another. And then once those are identified, you can then take steps to mitigate those biases, because as Dr. Patricia Devine told us, bias is a learned behavior, and as such it can be unlearned. And the first thing is to be able and willing to do that kind of initiative and testing. And so I think it's hugely important right now, and hopefully I'm bringing new information to the people here today, but Dr. Greenwald in 1998, he's the one who invented the implicit association test. Many of you may have heard it out of Harvard. It's called Project Implicit. It wasn't designed to be a diagnostic tool, and he's acknowledged that. It was severely criticized by Blanton and Jacquard as lacking in construct validity. And so as a result of that, Dr. Pete Jones in England spent 3 years perfecting that tool and coming up with an implicit bias test called Implicitly. And what's really of note is that on the 19th, which was 2 days ago, Grenwald published a new paper. So it's just come out 2 days ago, and it's talking about his new research into this entire field. And what he is suggesting, which if it gains traction may be quite impactful in this whole space, is that we should be treating implicit bias as a public health problem. Not just on its own, but as a public health problem. And he's talked about a lot of the things that will be in my paper when it's published in a few months. But I think that we may be seeing some bold new initiatives coming through in this space.
Interesting. So before I throw this question to the panel, I'd like you to throw those questions to the audience, if anyone would like to answer. So we've been talking about implicit bias, unconscious bias. So the question here is, if it is unconscious, if it is implicit, and sometimes maybe unconscious, we don't know about it, we didn't inform it, or we didn't know how it got there, or whether it's even there. How do we then take responsibility for our biases if it is indeed unconscious? Anyone? Okay, please, the young lady in yellow.
I don't know whether this would completely answer that question, but one of the approaches that I've taken in our organization, instead of starting with the assessments and the policies, I've started on the awareness and creating the desire. And part of the approach that I've taken is starting by teaching about coloniality and how we sustain it, and whiteness, and connecting my own stories and experiences, and giving people an opportunity to see how it is that they sustain. Because a lot of times, a lot of these concepts have been normalized so much that we don't even ask questions. So I have found it to be very impactful because and I do it in a way that is more encouraging of conversation, because if you get an opportunity to assess yourself from a coloniality and whiteness perspective, you realize that we are all affected. And then once that interest part comes in, then there's that desire to know what else is it that I don't know. And that sort of is the approach that I've taken, and I found that a lot of people have been very interested in what does it look like for me.
Thank you very much for that contribution. Please. Any other person would like to answer that question, perhaps from a different perspective? Okay. Somebody? No. So I'll throw it back to my panel. So why would I be asked to take responsibility for something that I'm not doing consciously, if it is indeed unconscious?
Well, if I could jump on that, I guess, I think the point is that whether the effects of a person's bias is conscious or not, the effects are equally as damaging. It doesn't matter whether it was done consciously or subconsciously. We spoke yesterday about, say you have a manager in a position of power, and they have two employees, one whom they like and one whom they have bias against. So one they have bias in favor of, one they have bias against. When they do the same thing, so let's say they are given an assignment and they're successful at the assignment. Subject A, successful at the assignment, the manager is in favor of it, they will internalize the success. So they did that well because they're really good, I knew they could do a good job, it's wonderful. Subject B, they externalize the success and say, oh, anybody could have done that well. It's not because that person was great, it's just because it was an easy assignment. If it was the opposite, where they both failed at the assignment, the one they like, they say, they externalize the effect on the one they like and say, well, it's not their fault. It was a really tough assignment. Anybody would have failed it. The person they have bias against, They internalize it, right? So it's exactly the opposite. And they say, well, I knew they couldn't do it, just went and proved it, right? So the result is damaging to the person who has the bias against them, whether the manager did it on purpose or not. The manager needs to be aware and know that their behavior and their attitude is destroying people's lives, right? And so it's important that implicit bias testing be broadened. It should be throughout entire organizations, and it needs to be from top down. The top leadership needs to step up and do this testing first. And so at TNT, we've done projects with the Solicitor General's office, lectured to the cybersecurity unit of the RCMP, and in all these organizations, we're starting to see when you have top-down buy-in, that's when you start to gain traction. When people realize that they're doing it, it can't be that bad. Because when people are afraid that their results, because you don't know what your result's going to be, it's implicit, right? So if they're afraid that if the result is really negative, that the organization might hold that against them somehow and it'll affect their careers, they'll never get promoted again and that kind of a thing, or there'll be social consequences to it. But that's not the way that we're suggesting those type of tests be used. The results are individual, they're your results for your education. If there's something that's very problematic, then there should be other measures available that can be used to bring this to the forefront. And I'm pretty sure that with TNT, anybody here that would like to do a couple of these tests, say 4 of these tests, that can be made available for you to try on your own, just so that you can try it.
I'd like to try that.
I think it's an exciting thing. I know anyone who's done more than 4, usually you come out in one area, you have a bias in one area, and that happened to me. I had one area where I had a bias, and I said, oh, there's no way. The test is wrong. I don't have a bias in this area. And then I was on a Zoom call, and I'm not going to identify what my area was. I was on a Zoom call. No. So there are 9 squares up there, and the person in the bottom right square, they were in this area, and I said to myself, they made a comment. It was a good comment. And in my head, I said, well, that's an intelligent comment. Well, why wouldn't I think that person would make an intelligent comment? And that was my aha moment. I do have a bias with regard to that. And now, right, because the thing is, once your bias becomes known, you can now take steps to mitigate it. So how does bias show itself? It's not always, being Ku Klux Klan wearing a pointy hat around. No, it could be things like speaking over people, or not paying as much attention to them when they're making suggestions, or taking their ideas as your own, that kind of thing, maybe implicitly. But now I'm very aware, when I'm with that segment, that I don't do any of those things. And that's what I think the power of the implicit bias test is.
Thank you very much. I will definitely do that test. I
Definitely
feel
make it
like I'm
available.
not biased at all,
Yeah.
right? So I'm waiting to do that test. But I would like to, allow the audience to ask some questions. I'm sure you have some questions, that are burning in your heart about this topic and some of the views that have been shared on this topic. Anyone has a question to ask to our panel? Okay. Someone there.
Yeah, my question would be pertaining to what Litsi said, because I'm interested in engaging from this point of view as well. So for assessments and policies, if you start from there, but like we talked about in terms of awareness and the desire to change, so if you ask questions and there's not that awareness of the need, depending on who the population is, how does that skew the information that you gather? Or if you start from a policy point of view and you change the policies, but people in the organization don't know why you're making the changes, and it becomes a matter of, they're becoming politically correct, how do you address that on the onset so that people want to have that change?
Yeah. I mentioned assessments and policy and document reviews, but before that, there's a whole process as well, right? And that's engaging the organization and its employees through a change management communications plan, communications, awareness. What we start off with are kickoff meetings, where we talk to the organization about what that process is going to look like over the next several months, and what type of communications need to land with the employees. What needs to go out, or what should go out, for example. We help to curate that communication because, as you said, awareness in the first step is going to be key, right? And as Phil mentioned as well, the top-down approach, the leadership really needs to be engaged in that process so that its employees as well can understand what that's going to look like. Usually an EDI strategy takes 4 to 5 months. But we always say that it could take longer because it will depend on what that engagement with staff looks like, because that's going to be really important for them to understand that process of assessments, right? Know that we're going to be speaking to them through focus groups or through surveys and questionnaires, and ensuring that psychologically safe space, right? For those employees to speak, for those employees to feel comfortable to come through with those topics that might be at unease for them. So although I talked about assessments and policies, there is another step right before that that is key for engagement of the organization and its employees.
Thank you very much for sharing that. I think the lady, yeah, okay.
Thank you. Just to go back to that previous question about implicit bias and how do we address it if we're not aware that we have it. Nadira shared something really amazing last night. In her leadership position at Norquest, she's come into a role where in her team they state their implicit biases. So if they have a good feeling about somebody of their interviewing, they'll say, I feel good about this person. I have an implicit bias, a positive implicit bias about this. So there's not necessarily this negative tone all of the time, or to say, and to state, I actually had a negative experience with this person. It doesn't mean that they're negatively going to impact our organization, but I have to say that let's take that power away from that perspective and let's interview them in a neutral space again.
Wow.
So what she was telling us, through sharing our implicit biases, you hear about the positive, you hear about the negative, and then you enter a neutral space. So I just wanted to bring attention to that point that she made.
Thank you for that. Thank you.
And I think a really critical aspect of that would be having those trusting relationships. It has to be really respectful, and the people in the room have to be comfortable with some difference, with navigating those conversations. Totally agree with Nadira. I know her, and I think she's phenomenal. But and so I support that. But sometimes people aren't actually ready to have those kinds of conversations. So how do we get to that place, that safe, respectful place?
Interesting. Thank you so much. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Oh, I can talk loud. I don't know if this is loud enough. Thank you to all the panelists for sharing, and I really appreciate the emphasis on the respectful conversation that goes alongside changing structures and policy. Something that I've learned, and I guess a simple reminder, and I was thinking about it when you were mentioning the work that comes before the focus groups or surveys or even those kind of information sharing conversations, is really ensuring that people know how what they're sharing will be used. Because I think often, I'm guilty of this too, forget that that how will the information that you're sharing or your experiences be used to help shape or inform the next steps, and then really that cycle back of how was that information used or not used. So just your words were reminding me of the importance of that, of really understanding how it'll be used to inform change, and then that loop back of how was it used, or how did it inform, what does that change look like? Yeah,
that's really important. And usually that is kind of stated all over. This is how we will use the information. This is how it will be shared. We don't share the information with the organization at all, because it's important that we take that data, we analyze that data to see where those intersections of identities, where those inequities exist, right, for those employees.
Thank you for that. Was someone raising their hand? Okay. Yeah. So I'll use this opportunity to actually tell tell you a problem that I am having right now, and I'll see if, you can help provide a solution to this. So, and this is within the context of inclusive leadership, which, is kind of the last part of this segment. But I am currently hiring for a position at our STEM and Career Exploration Lab. And I've interviewed a few people, and there's this 2 people that I interviewed. One of them is so good. I like the attitude and I like the way she comes across. I think she'll be very friendly with the youth that we're working with, who already need someone who can make them feel welcome and make them feel comfortable. But I had only one issue with her, which is the fact that I felt like her accent was a little strong, that it was a little difficult for me to hear her, some of the things responses she was giving. Now I'm thinking how then, when it comes to managing a group of middle schoolers, maybe they might not be able to hear her properly. But I like her. She seems to be a good person for the job. And it's a facilitator role. And then this other person I interviewed, very composed and collected, very educated. She even has a degree in education and, in the field of STEM. And I thought, this person seems like, the person for the job. But I feel like the attitude is not quite the same. And I said to myself, and then this person might actually not stay long on the job. Implicit bias, I don't know, just my thought. So I had to, now I'm asking myself, who am I going to hire? I mean, how do I deal with this? I'm not trying to discriminate against this person because of their accent. I do have a strong accent myself, right? So how then do I choose without being biased, right? Any solutions from me?
Well, yes.
Go ahead.
Sorry.
No, go ahead. I have thoughts too, but go ahead, please.
Okay.
I would suggest, and I don't know if everybody else feels the same way, but it seems to me that you want to hire the first person, the first one you described. You should hire my son, by the way. Okay, not in the running. So the first person that you spoke about, just the terms you're using, the way you're used to describe them, and the way you talk about the second person, the first person seems to be the better person for the job. It's interesting you mentioned this thing about accents. We had a case in the corrections system in Toronto, in the corrections system where they're working in the jails. And they had some correctional officers who we were lecturing to, and they brought this up, where they had East Indian accent. So fairly strong East Indian accent, no problem. And they were getting complaints from other guards regarding this East Indian accent and not being able to understand them. Yet they had people there who had very strong Scottish brogue accents, which were way harder to understand than the East Indian accent, but never a complaint about the Scottish accent.
Implicit
right?
bias.
Well, yes, more than that is outright bias. There's another term for it, but I don't believe I'm allowed to use the term in the present company. But the point is, whose problem is it, right? Whose problem is it when you don't want to spend the time to listen carefully and understand what the person is saying? The person has a message they want to get across to you, then it's incumbent on you to sit down, take the time to listen and understand, and not let your bias, simply because it's not a Western type accent, color that, in my opinion.
Thank you. Catherine?
I was just agree totally. There's a hierarchy of accents. Some accents are desired, others are not in certain societies, cultures. So I always talk about what are the skills needed by a candidate to be a successful communicator. So ask very concrete questions around how do you ensure your message is understood? How do you communicate with varying audiences, a diversity of people? So and you structure it around it's a skill set. So it's the other thing is, of course, we all have accents, and it's which accent are we most comfortable with, right? And we don't want to hire the person based on their accent. So I always look at what skills are needed for the job, and how do you evaluate it?
Thank you. Any other solutions from me? Thank you. Please. Okay. More people with solutions for me.
So my thought went to, so this person is going to be serving the youth, right?
Yes.
So trying to find a common ground there. So which person will be able to, beyond communication, connect with those youth. So if it is the STEM, very often in that area, I was in the technology industry as well. When people speak that same language, they can connect more easily, right? Like the same jargon, they understand the same thing. So really understanding what's that common ground between the students and the person that's going to be serving them. That's really important to making a decision there. And often in the interviewing process, there are people, so there are different personality styles, right? There's this personality style that is great at communicating and connecting right away. That first person that you talked about appears to be that personality. And so it's very easy for us to say, oh yeah, I connected with them, they're so lively, they talk so well, right? It's simply their personality. This is how they are. But back to what was just mentioned, going back to the skill and the competencies, it's very important to go back to that, because the other person might not have shown the same characteristics, the same nature, or that same communication skill in their interview, but do they have the competencies needed for the actual job, and can they actually connect better with the student depending on what it is that the student is looking for?
Thank you. But before the next person answers, I must say that the second person has the technical skills. She has the language. She has almost everything that we need for the job. She is well-rounded. So that's where it becomes difficult. This other person is still young. She's just a new graduate who, is just really struggling. But I like her. But the truth is, this other person checks all the boxes, I must say to you. But the question is, who do I hire? Please.
But you said that you
Find
didn't
the
think the
common
second one would
ground.
last. You said you thought that
I
she
don't
would
think they
leave.
will last, actually. They made a comment that made me realize that maybe they wouldn't last. But then it's one of those cases where you think, even if this person is with us for 3 months, they will make a transformation, in the whole program. They will set up structures. They will put things in place for this program to succeed. So you get my bias?
Well, and, sorry. The other quick thing is, you don't know how long the other person's going to last.
No.
So basing your judgment on, I think this person's going to stay around longer, might be the worst decision.
Might not be right. Absolutely. Please,
100%.
carry on.
Just to kind of continue on in the conversation of, are they able to communicate in ways that connects with those that need that connection? From that standpoint, the other part of it is, where can you continue to build capacity? So looking at, do they check off all the boxes, and is communication their one point where they need some additional support? So I'm not talking about changing accents or anything like that. I'm talking about ability to articulate in a way that others can connect in with them. Where can you, as a leader, and have that accountability and responsibility as a leader, reach out and help support individuals that may not necessarily have the opportunities that they would have been given through this position? And so thinking from that aspect as well is, what can you give back to this individual to be able to succeed in this role and in other roles as a potential future leader in this organization or in other organizations?
Thank you. Thank you. There's a gentleman over there who wants to. Okay, no, him first, please. Thank you.
No, I just want to share an incident that has happened in my life related to this. So I'm very new in Canada. It's just been 2 months here. So I was working back home in India with indigenous communities. So my HR hired me and sent me to the team. And I'm from the southern part of India, and we don't speak Hindi. And I was sent to the northern part of India, where the main language is Hindi, and with the indigenous languages were there. So my team was like, okay, why did the HR hired him? He don't know the language. And they just sent me to the team to work there. And I was slowly learning. I had my South Indian accent with Hindi. I was very slowly talking to the community. And after 3 months, my team coordinator, before my probation period was getting over, my team coordinator went to the community to ask, how is he, are you able to understand what he is speaking? And what they said was, yeah, he speaks very slowly, so we are able to listen to him properly. And just like you mentioned, he speaks from the heart, so that we are able to connect with him. And we think he's better than others because they speak very fast and he speaks very slow, and he tries to understand from us. He learns our language. So that was really helpful for me. So that's just a point that I wanted to add.
That's
Thank
very
you.
helpful for me too. Thank you very much. The other gentleman.
Thank you very much. One fundamental thing that I'm a scientist, and I have a very technical role. So when it comes to hiring, we look for people with a technical skill set who are equipped to deliver. People who are very specialized lack a lot of things. That is a fact. So as a leader, when you're hiring onto a team, you need to find out the strength of your team, the existing strength of your team. Do you have a good communicator on the team? Do you have the go-getter on the team? What do you lack? Which is the soft skills that you lack. So you might hire the person who has the technical expertise that you need, the person who is checking all the boxes, but they lack just a few things. But you have that on your team already. So what you do is that you bring this person on to complement the team. We should not forget that when you hire people, you hire them to deliver. At the same time, they also expect to grow. And your ability to train these people to grow will determine whether they stay long or leave. I always tell recruiters, anyone looking for a job is looking for a job so that in 5 years' time, they are not the same person who joined your company 5 years earlier. They've developed. So they are coming to give you their skill set. What are you going to give them in return?
In return.
Usually, leaders identify these special needs. We were preparing a presentation. At the time, I was a graduate student in the US teaching chemistry. And when we go to teach the undergraduates, I say phenolphthalein. And in America, they say phenolphthalein. So when I say phenolphthalein, I didn't realize that the students didn't understand what I was trying to tell them. And some of them went to complain to our coordinator. The coordinator realized that there's a language barrier. So what they quickly did was, hey, we need to teach you how we pronounce some things in the US so that you learn. It may come across as if they're trying to look down on you, but they want to train you. It came as a training. And when that training was offered, it allowed me to quickly integrate and deliver. Because when you are hired into a technical role, you are not there to be trained in that technical capacity. But you need to be given some soft skills to succeed. So whoever you are hiring, your team must help that person to succeed. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. And I like when you said soft skills. That's the language. That's actually what we believe is lacking today in many, many talents. The hard skills are easier. You would be surprised, than the soft skills. And that leads me, and I know our time is far spent, and I'd like our panel to give us their closing statements talking about inclusive leadership, because most of what you all have said goes back to leadership, all right? What's the role of the leader, and how can we ensure that we have inclusive leadership in our workplaces? So I'd like you to give your closing statements, if you have one, for us as we round up this segment.
Sure. So one of the things that I teach at a college here in Edmonton, Northern Alberta Institute of Technology, is cultural intelligence. And a lot of people talk about emotional intelligence being important, but I feel like emotional intelligence is a culturally conditioned concept and skill. So I think for leaders to be inclusive, having a trait like cultural intelligence where you're able to really understand the values, behaviors, of different people is essential and key, is one of the traits. There's many other traits, but for me, cultural intelligence is a trait that I think it's not spoken enough about, and it's a skill that I think is a starting point to get to that inclusive leadership skill set.
Thank you very much, Lindsay. Catherine?
I think leaders need to lead by example. Walk the talk. Otherwise, they're not going to get buy-in from the broader group, from the broader employee group. And by walking the talk, I mean, truly, authentically walking the talk, believing in it. So that goes back to that recruitment piece. Who are we recruiting as our leaders in an organization? And what values do they bring? Do they value all the staff, the various perspectives, the individual people? Or are we all numbers, right? So it goes back to leadership, the values, and also explaining to leaders about the equity or the EDI continuum. So it's a journey. It's taken hundreds, thousands of years for us to get to this point. Okay, so how are we going to change, and what does that journey look like, and what is the continuum? And start raising awareness. Leaders need to have that educational piece as well. So how do we do that? So.
Thank you, Catherine. Phil?
Yeah, I think both my colleagues have spoken brilliantly and eloquently on this, and so I agree totally with everything that's been said there. The only thing I might add might be making ourselves and our leaders aware of our blind spots. And our blind spots are those areas where we have that implicit bias. And an easy way to do it is the implicit bias test. And I will try and integrate a short blind spot video later this afternoon, which hopefully will make this point.
Thank you very much. It's been a wonderful, wonderful time. By the way, we should all take that test. I'm going to take it. And it's just been wonderful just engaging with this very intelligent and experienced panelists. And yes, that would be it for us today.
Awesome.
Let's keep thinking about EDI.
Thank you so much. Let's give them a round of applause. Thank you. You may be